On the night of December 4th, 1774, a section of Rue d'Enfer, which translates, and I want you to hold that translation in your mind, Road to Hell, collapsed without warning. 3 houses fell into the ground. Not damaged, not cracked, into the ground. The street simply opened and swallowed them. Paris had seen sinkholes before, but this one was different, because when the engineers lowered lanterns into the hole, they didn't hit bedrock. They hit tunnels, passages, carved chambers, and those chambers were not new. The King of France commissioned an investigation. The man who ran it was a civil engineer named Charles-Axel Guillaumeau. And what Guillaumeau produced over the next decade, it's sitting in the Archives Nationales in Paris right now, you can look it up, was something that has quietly bothered me since I first found it. He produced a map of subterranean Paris that was, by all surviving accounts, more detailed than any map of the surface city that existed at the time. I'm going to come back to that detail, because it's the thing that changes everything. The city above keeps going. The city below gets forgotten. This video is about what happens when someone finally looks down. Let me tell you what I'm doing in this video, and what I'm not doing. I'm not going to tell you that a lost civilization built these tunnels. I'm not going to tell you governments are hiding something from you specifically. I don't know those things, and I want to be careful here. Anybody who tells you they do know those things is selling you something. What I'm going to do is take 3 specific locations, Paris, Edinburgh, Seattle, and show you where the official record and the physical evidence stop matching. Real archives, real dates, real names. And then I'm going to ask you one question at the end. That's the whole video. Charles-Axel Guillaumeau was appointed Inspector General of Quarries in 1777. That title alone is worth pausing on. Paris had a government office, a standing office with a budget and a staff, dedicated specifically to managing what was beneath the city. Not sewers, not catacombs, quarries. The limestone under Paris had been mined, continuously, without break, since the Romans. The city above was, in a very literal sense, built from the city below. And by the 1770s, the excavation had been going on for so long and had become so extensive that nobody, not the engineers, not the city administrators, not the crown, had a reliable picture of what the underside of Paris actually looked like. Guillaumeau's job was to find out. What he found was staggering. Neighborhoods had been built on top of voids that could, and sometimes did, swallow them without warning. The Rue d'Enfer collapse was not an anomaly. It was a symptom. What he found, specifically, the tunnels went on for hundreds of kilometers. Hundreds. The city above was sitting on top of something that made the city above look small. But here's the thing that caught my attention when I was going through this material. Guillaumeau didn't just map tunnels. The 1815 atlas produced by his successor, Erasure de Thury, and this document is freely downloadable from archive.org right now. I'll put the link in the description. Go look at it yourself. This atlas contains plates that show not just tunnel paths, but quarry chambers, pillar placements, and geological strata at a resolution that is, frankly, extraordinary for 1815. I want to describe one plate specifically. Plate 7, or what gets labeled as such in the archive scan, shows a cross-section of the limestone below the left bank. The chambers are numbered. The pillars Guillaumeau's team installed to prevent further collapse are marked with a different symbol than the original Roman cuts. You can see, in one image, 600 years of excavation laid out like a geological record. What you can also see, and this is the detail I keep returning to, is how much of it is labeled origin unknown. Not medieval, not Roman. Origin unknown. The official story is, Roman era and medieval quarrying created the tunnels. City engineers mapped them to prevent further collapses. Problem identified, problem managed. That story is probably correct, but I want you to hold one detail. The sheer scale of the existing excavation that Guillaumeau encountered in 1777. He wasn't mapping a construction project. He was mapping something that had already been going on for by his own account, centuries, and that had never been systematically documented. The city above was built. The city below was discovered. I want to be careful here. There is a version of this story that gets told in certain corners of YouTube where the Paris tunnels are evidence of an ancient pre-Roman civilization with technology we don't understand. I'm not telling you that. I have no evidence for that. The quarrying history is well documented and mundane. Romans needed stone, they dug, their successors kept digging, nobody kept good records. But the question Guillaume's work raises is legitimate. At what point does a city's official record stop being a map of what's there and start being a map of what authorities knew was there? Those are not the same thing. And in Edinburgh, in the 1990s, a formal archaeological survey accidentally proved it. The South Bridge in Edinburgh was built under an Act of Parliament passed in 1785. It was completed in 1788, and it is, technically speaking, a bridge. 19 arches spanning the valley between the Old Town and what would become the south side of the city. But 19 arches create 18 enclosed spaces. And those spaces, built into the bridge structure itself, stone vaults that were originally intended for shops and workshops, were sealed off sometime in the early 19th century. The official reason given is flooding. The vaults repeatedly flooded. Tenants left. The entrances were built over. The vaults were forgotten. That is the official explanation. And it is, almost certainly, correct. Here's where it gets interesting. A story circulates, and I want to flag this carefully, because the version that circulates in alternative history communities has details I cannot verify from primary records. That a rugby team broke through a wall during construction work in 1985 and found themselves in an intact vault. Furniture, objects, left as though people had simply walked out. I can't confirm that specific account from the Edinburgh City Archives. What I can confirm is what the formal surveys found when people actually started looking. When formal archaeological assessment of the vaults began in the 1990s, surveyors found spaces that had not been officially mapped, sections of the underground network that the city's own records didn't account for. Not conspiracy, not suppression. Institutional knowledge had simply faded. The thing that was built became separated from the record that it was built. Guillaume found it in Paris in 1777. Edinburgh found it in its own foundations in the 1990s. Real archives, real dates, real names. If this kind of investigation, primary sources, real archives, honest uncertainty, is how you want to spend your time, consider subscribing. I don't do list videos. I don't do thumbnails with red circles. If that's worth something to you, the button's there. The Edinburgh Vaults are now a tourist attraction. You can book a tour. The official framing is forgotten history, now rediscovered. And that framing is probably right. But the Edinburgh finding is not a one-off. Infrastructure planners doing standard due diligence, running ground-penetrating radar before laying new utilities, have found repeatedly that the maps are wrong. Not occasionally, as a pattern. In a majority of European city centers studied, surveyors couldn't produce complete maps of what existed below their own central districts. Not because of conspiracy, because records degrade, institutions change. The knowledge held by one generation of engineers isn't automatically transferred to the next. It requires someone, every generation, to care enough to pass it forward. The question isn't, what are they hiding? The question is, what did they lose track of? On June 6, 1889, a glue pot in a cabinet maker's shop on First Avenue in Seattle caught fire. By the time it was over, 25 city blocks had burned. The fire destroyed the commercial core of a city that was, at that moment, barely 40 years old. Seattle rebuilt immediately. And here is where the official record and the physical reality diverge in a way I find genuinely hard to explain away. The original street level of Seattle, the level at which the pre-fire city was built, is now, in significant portions of the Pioneer Square district, one full story underground. The official explanation: the city raised its streets during Reconstruction, building over the original ground floor of existing structures to address drainage and grade problems. The original storefronts, the original sidewalks, the original street-level windows, they're still there, below the current street. You can take a tour, and that explanation, again, is almost certainly correct. The drainage problem in pre-fire Seattle was real and documented. The rebuilding decision was a practical engineering choice. But here's the detail that I keep returning to. The underground is not a ruin. It's not a burned-out shell. It's a corridor. The buildings, or rather the below-ground portions of what became the buildings above, are largely intact. The storefronts have windows that once faced the street. The sidewalks have skylights that were originally street-level glass panels. This is not what a buried city looks like if it was abandoned. This is what a buried city looks like if the ceiling was raised. I want to be careful here. I am describing what I observed in the available historical record and photographs from the University of Washington digital collections. I am not claiming the city was buried by a catastrophe that history doesn't acknowledge. The fire of 1889 is documented in exhaustive detail. The reconstruction decision is documented. The raising of the streets is documented. What I'm noting is, the physical result looks different from the explanation. It looks specifically like something that was functioning and then was roofed over. That story is probably correct. But I've tried to find a version of it that doesn't bother me, and I haven't found one. Let me stop here. Because I've been building towards something, and I want to be honest about what it is. I did not set out to make a Tartaria video. If you've spent any time in alternative history, you know the theory. That a global civilization existed before the one we acknowledge. That it left behind anomalous architecture and underground infrastructure. And that this history was deliberately erased by successor states. Whatever administrative apparatus replaced whatever came before. The Tartaria hypothesis, in its various forms, claims that cities like Paris, Edinburgh, and Seattle are not what we're told they are. The Tartaria community noticed something real. I'm not going to tell you Tartaria is real. I don't have evidence that it is, but I am going to tell you this. They noticed that the official explanations for what lies beneath these cities, in Paris, in Edinburgh, in Seattle, and in dozens of other locations that space won't allow me to cover here, these explanations are often incomplete. Not because of suppression, because of institutional knowledge that degrades across generations, that falls through the cracks of cities burning and vaults being sealed and quarry inspectors dying and their notes being filed and occasionally misfiled. And when ordinary people walk through a city and notice that the underground is bigger than the official map, or that the official story has a seam in it, or that the architecture below the surface looks wrong for the explanation being offered, they are not crazy. They are noticing something real. They are just in many cases reaching for the wrong explanation for a real observation. That sentence is the thing I'd want a Tartaria believer to hear, and also the thing I'd want a skeptic to hear. The observation is real. The tunnels are there. The maps don't match. The explanation, lost knowledge, not hidden knowledge, is less exciting and more disturbing. Because if it's hidden, someone knows. If it's lost, nobody does. Real archives, real dates, real names, and no one who can tell you what's missing. Because the people who knew are gone. This raises a simple but critical question. If the official record of what exists below these cities is, by the testimony of infrastructure researchers, by the findings of municipal archaeologists, by the Edinburgh City Archives themselves, demonstrably incomplete, then how would we know? Not, how would we know if something was hidden? How would we know if something was simply lost? I want to go back to Guillermo for a moment. Not to the discovery. I've told you that. To what the discovery required. He was lowering lanterns into the Rue d'Enfer sinkhole in 1774. Road to hell, remember that. And he was doing it because the ground had opened and swallowed a street. And nobody in the administration of Paris could tell him what was down there. He didn't find evidence of a conspiracy. He found evidence of accumulated ignorance, and that's what I keep coming back to. The alternative history community, and I've spent a lot of time in it, I understand its appeal, tends to reach for the dramatic explanation. Hidden history, deliberate erasure, a ruling class that knows what we don't. But the boring explanation, the one that Guillaume's own career supports, that the Edinburgh Vault rediscovery supports, that infrastructure surveyors keep confirming with ground-penetrating radar runs before laying new utilities, is more unsettling in a different way. We didn't lose this knowledge because someone took it. We lost it because knowledge, municipal, institutional, generational, is fragile. It requires continuous maintenance. It requires someone every generation to care enough to transfer it forward. Not conspiracy, not suppression. Just the ordinary chaos of cities burning and streets being razed and vaults being sealed against flooding and quarry inspectors dying and their notes being filed and occasionally misfiled. The city above keeps going. The city below gets forgotten. I started this video on Rue d'Enfer, Road to Hell, December 4th, 1774. 3 houses, swallowed by the ground. Guillaume went down with his lanterns, and what he found was a city beneath the city, larger than the maps suggested, older than the records indicated, and built by people who did not leave a forwarding address. The official story is, Romans quarried stone. Medieval Parisians kept quarrying. Nobody kept good records. The tunnels accumulated, and eventually the ground above began to fail. That story is probably true. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. The line I wrote in my notes the first time I pulled up the Erasure de Thury Atlas on archive.org and started going through the plates. The map Guillaume made of what was below Paris was more complete than any map that existed of what was above it. Someone, at some point, knew exactly what was down there, and then that knowledge had to be reconstructed, from scratch, by lantern light, after the ground opened up and swallowed a street. I've tried to find a version of that detail that doesn't bother me. I haven't found one. I don't know what it means. I'm not sure it means anything beyond the obvious, that cities are old, and memory is short, and the ground holds things longer than institutions do. But I'll tell you what it made me want to do. Go back, pull more records, look at more cities. The Erasure de Thury Atlas, the one from 1815, the one you can download right now from archive.org, references passages that extend beyond Paris's currently mapped quarry limits. I want to find out where those passages were supposed to go. That's the next video. Because if Guillaume found what he found in Paris in 1777, and Edinburgh found what it found in the 1990s, and Seattle is still giving tours of a street level that the official explanation says was simply raised, then the question isn't whether there's more to find. The question is whether anyone is looking carefully enough.